Welcome to Hopkins at Home. My name is Caitlin Magatin, and I'm really glad that you are here tonight. And hope that our time together is really beneficial as we learn about mental health tools for a resilient brain. Just want to welcome you and introduce myself. I work as a licensed clinical professional counselor. I have a master's in mental health counseling from Johns Hopkins University, and I worked at the Carey Business School at Johns Hopkins as a career coach for many years, and still partner with the university through the Academy of Women in Leadership to provide executive coaching. So my background in counseling and coaching make me excited for this topic, and that you would come here to learn for yourself, learn for your colleagues, for your family members, more about mental health and what it means to take care of your brain. Tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about what mental health actually is. What does resilience really look like and mean? What is this concept of well-being? We're going to talk about neuroscience and how the brain functions, because even though we can't see our brain, it's a really important part of the way our body functions. We're going to learn about strategies to self-regulate and manage difficult emotions. And I hope that you walk away with a toolkit of self-care strategies for the uncertainty that we experience, especially at this time, and just transitions that happen in life. So just to start off, what is mental health? It's really brain health. We might talk about, if you break your leg and you get a cast, you can see that you've broken your leg, but we don't see our brain. So sometimes it's hard to really understand what mental health is. Our mental health includes our emotional, our psychological well-being, so our thoughts and our feelings. The World Health Organization defines mental health as a state of well-being in which an individual realizes his or her abilities and can cope with the normal stresses of life. They can work productively and are able to make a contribution to their community. Sometimes there are things that are outside of our control that contribute to mental health issues. It could be a traumatic event such as the death of a loved one, a financial loss, or a divorce. Maybe it's something that's predisposed in your family history. Maybe there's a chemical imbalance in the brain, a genetic predisposition. Maybe you've experienced brain damage due to a head injury. Maybe it's a medical concern that contributes to the functioning of your brain and the feelings and experiences that you're having, past abuse, or even just going through a stressful transition. I think a lot of times people think that if they have a mental health issue, something is really wrong. And oftentimes we experience anxiety or uncomfortable emotions because we've gone through a transition or an experience that is stressful. I think we can all agree that right now we're going through a stressful season collectively. There's some research that's been done by the Kaiser Family Foundation, and they found that during the pandemic, about 4 in 10 adults in the US have reported symptoms of anxiety or depression, and a share of that's been largely consistent, which has been up from 1 in 10 adults who reported these symptoms from January to June in 2019. They also found that many adults are reporting specific impacts to their mental health: difficulty sleeping, eating, increases in alcohol consumption or substance use, and worsening chronic conditions due to worry and stress over the coronavirus. So this is real. We're experiencing a lot of uncertainty, change, loss, and that impacts how we feel each day. And that's really normal, right? It's an abnormal event and our brain is responding in a really normal way. Maybe you've experienced some symptoms of anxiety or depression. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are depressed or you have diagnosable anxiety, because we all experience to some degree, some level of anxiety or even feelings of sadness during your life. It's very normal. It means you're alive. But there also can be some overlap in some of these symptoms. So maybe you notice physical symptoms of a mental health issue. Maybe, you're noticing that your heart is racing, and you're anxious and worried. Maybe you're feeling really sad or it's hard to get out of bed. These are physical signs, kind of the tip of the iceberg of what's going on emotionally in our minds. And oftentimes that is caused by our thoughts. And we can recognize those. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the tools that can help in recognizing how we can take care of ourselves through that. Sometimes there's an overlap, but just because we experience anxiety doesn't mean that that is the experience you're going to have forever. But these signs can point to what's happening inside of our brains. So if you experience feelings of anxiety, it doesn't mean that you're not resilient. Again, it's very human and normal to react and feel your feelings during a stressful time. But resilience is the capacity or the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. I also want to mention, if you have questions during this presentation, feel free to put them in the chat box and I'm happy to answer them throughout. And I'll also leave some time at the end of the presentation today to do some Q&A. So we will all go through stressful times in life. That's part of being human. But how we adapt to it and how we take care of ourselves determines if we're really able to be more resilient and build a resilient mind. You might say, well, how do I actually create a resilient brain? Like, how do I actually have access to that? Well, our brains are plastic. There's neuroplasticity, which means that the brain can adapt to changes by forming new neural connections over time. So if you, for example, if someone has been in a car accident and they have to learn how to walk again, the brain can adapt and master new skills and store memories and information, anew. So we can learn and train our brains to think differently during times of stress. Maybe the way that we talk to ourselves. If we say, this is never going to end, I'm always going to be without a job. Maybe you got laid off during COVID. That kind of rumination, right? That belief system is going to form a quick jump for your brain to really hold on to that narrative that doesn't serve you and open you up for possibilities. So we can train our brains to process information differently, but it takes time and it also takes practice and awareness. So tonight we're going to talk more about how do we kind of slow down and reflect so that we can understand what maybe the stories are that are coming up, what are our worries, and how can we train our brains to process these emotions and these thoughts during stress. So I want to talk a little bit about the brain. Again, we don't see our brains, and yet our brains do so much for us. You can see in this brain that there are different parts that control our speech, smell, hearing, motor control, touch, taste, our ability to plan, to problem solve, to read, our vision, right? So all of these parts of our brain are so crucial to our overall functioning. And if any part of the brain has been damaged, that impacts our overall functioning day to day. So sometimes, even though it may be hard to say I'm experiencing anxiety or depression because we can't see it, our brains are impacted. And where we really see that is in the limbic system. This is the emotional brain, if you will. So if you look at this picture, the center there is the limbic system, and that is the emotional or feeling part of the brain. And the limbic system is a group of brain structures. It includes the hippocampus, the amygdala, and that attaches emotion and meaning to memories there. So it's part of the reward system. So maybe when you look at your phone and you get a rush of dopamine, or you feel some, kind of like a little natural like zing or high that, if you maybe have some sugar, or you, you get a reward system going, we have an emotional response in that part of the brain. If you've heard of fight or flight, that is also the area that responds when we feel like we're in danger or there's some sort of threat. Do we fight to stay safe, or do we try to run away from something that maybe feels scary or dangerous? Do we freeze? Are we paralyzed? This is also the center where we have memory, and this is where we have attention and learning. So a pretty crucial, important part of the brain. And I think this is so interesting and so important to understand what's happening, because it really normalizes mental health. We all have a brain, and so all of these parts of the brain functioning are really important for our overall well-being. As I mentioned, emotions are really important because they help us survive. If you're being chased in the wild, you need to feel nervous, right? Because that's going to motivate you to run. So emotions are automatic, and they're a psychological reaction. Now, sometimes we have a reaction, we have an emotion because we perceive a threat. For example, if you're on a hike and you see a stick in the woods, but you think if your brain registers this is a snake, then you're going to feel in your body I would imagine some anxiety. At least my heart would be racing, or my hands might be sweaty, and I might start to back away. But if I notice my brain re-registers, oh, that's not a snake, that's a stick, I'm going to be able to kind of calm down because I'm not really in any threat or real danger. So our brain gets messages from our environment by our senses, what we see, what we smell, what we taste, what we feel. And so our body is communicating with our brain to say we're safe, or there's some sort of threat. Now, our brains are wired for negativity bias. And what that means is we are always scanning our environment to see, are we in danger? It actually really takes a lot of practice to be looking for what is going well, because our brains are trained to keep us alive and safe. So of course, there's a lot of difficult things that are going on in the world. So we have this heightened awareness, even more so, that things could be scary. So it's just interesting to think about how our brain really helps us stay safe. Now, these emotions they're neutral. So even though we don't really want to experience uncomfortable emotions, maybe sadness, fear, loneliness, feelings are just neutral. They're data, they're information to tell us, how we're doing. And then we get to be curious and ask ourselves, is this true? Just because I think that was a snake doesn't actually mean I am in danger and it was a snake. So slowing down and getting curious about the feelings that we are having can help us get some space in order to make decisions that are in our best interest. I know that it can be easy when we get really triggered very quickly to react because we want to protect ourselves. Maybe someone starts to, yell at us at work. And so we kind of emotionally, we want to defend. Maybe we want to run. Maybe we want to hide. Maybe we can say, I need a timeout, and, let's come back to this meeting in 10 minutes and we can, cool down and talk about things. So giving ourselves some space to get curious about what's happening inside of me right now, without judgment, can really help us then make decisions and behave in ways that are in alignment with our values. So I really like this graphic. This comes from an NPR article that was published about mapping emotions on the body. And there was a team of scientists in Finland, and they asked people to map out where they felt different emotions on their body. And they found that the results were pretty consistent across cultures. People reported that happiness and love sparked activity across nearly in the entire body. So you can see the love body there at the bottom left, and you can see kind of the heat, the red, all over the body, which is very opposite to depression. You can see in depression, the body, the color is blue. It's kind of a more dampened feeling in the arms and legs and head. The danger and fear, one's kind of triggered strong sensations in the chest area. So really interesting to kind of pay attention to the signals that our bodies give us about what we're feeling. If you can get curious about that experience, then you get a sense if you are in danger. You can see the picture here on the right. Someone's touching a hot stove. We feel the sensation of hot and probably pull our hands away before we even really register, oh, the stove is hot, I should probably move my hand, right? Our bodies automatically go into protection mode. So the sensations that we feel sometimes happen so quickly that it's hard to slow down and register, am I really in danger or not? Or did that person really intend to hurt me, right? Maybe you feel angry very quickly, at your parent, and maybe they didn't really mean to make you angry, and you still feel anger, but you can slow down and kind of check in with them. Is that what you really intended when you shared your feedback, right? But it's a very automatic system. Our nervous system, if coming back to that snake example, if we sense fear, you can see on the top left, the nervous system increases oxygen to your muscles and raises your heart rate so you can deal with the threat. It's an automated system. We don't have to think about it. So it's just, again, from the article there, if you want to read about it. But we can understand what's happening in our brains and maybe some of the thoughts and feelings when we can check in with our body and kind of map that. So it's pretty cool how our bodies are this automatic kind of alarm system for us to keep us alive and safe. So I want you to just check in for a moment. As we've been talking about emotions, this visual comes from a great app called the Mood Meter app. And this is a great way to kind of check in and track your emotions. So I want you to check in with yourself right now and how you're feeling. You can see that the y-axis here measures energy and the x-axis measures pleasantness. So which quadrant do you think represents how you're feeling? Are you feeling really high energy, but maybe not as pleasant, so you're in the red zone? Maybe you're feeling really pleasant, but lower energy, so you might be in the green zone. Just take a moment, check in. Where do you think you are? Maybe language helps. So looking again at this graphic, if you're low energy and low pleasantness, maybe you're feeling more bored or tired, lonely. If you're feeling high energy and pretty pleasant, maybe you're feeling joyful, happy, excited. Language is really powerful. If we can name our emotional experience, we can actually also start to comfort ourselves and validate our experience. So this is all about emotional intelligence. We talk about IQ, but EQ, emotional intelligence, is the capacity to be aware of, control, and express your own emotions, and to handle interpersonal relationships judiciously and empathetically. So the ability to know what's happening inside of you can help you then communicate with others. I felt really frustrated when you didn't show up to our coffee meeting yesterday, right? To identify your experience versus maybe telling other people what they need to do, right? There's a lot of intelligence in being able to understand what's happening inside. I'm feeling really tired because I didn't get a good night's rest. Maybe I want to take a nap today. Or I'm feeling really angry because I didn't eat lunch and I don't have energy for this conversation. So if we're able to access what's happening inside ourselves, we can also better meet our own needs and take care of ourselves. It's I think really helpful to understand how our emotions, our thoughts, and behaviors are all linked because these experiences happen so quickly inside of us and we can't see them. Again, slowing down and checking in helps us understand how we got to the emotional reaction or the behavior we got to, right? So, even if we can't really identify what our thoughts were at the moment, we can try to slow down and backtrack. So, all of our emotions are always triggered by a thought. We may not be aware of the thought, and that's where it takes some practice to understand what we're experiencing. But if we can trace it back, there's typically a situation, something that happens. It triggers a thought, which we interpret a situation, and then we have this narrative about what's happening, which fires up then an emotion, a feeling that comes from the thought, and then that has us act. So let me give you an example here. Um, I'm in a meeting and I'm giving a presentation, and I notice that someone is um, a colleague of mine is looking down and she's not paying attention to my presentation. And I have the thought, she doesn't think this is a good presentation. She doesn't think that what I'm presenting is important. That's my thought about what I'm seeing. The emotion is I'm feeling really angry. I really need her support and I'm feeling really upset that she's not paying attention. So after the meeting, I get really angry and I start to yell and I tell her I don't appreciate that she's not supporting me. All right. So this doesn't really happen, but if it did, we could go back to the situation. Now this situation, we really don't know what's happening for her. If I had decided at the end with the behavior to go over my colleague and check it out with her to say, I noticed that you were looking away or you were on your phone when I was presenting. Can you tell me more about what was going on there? I might learn what her side of the story is, right? She might think my presentation is awful, but might be something else. Maybe she tells me, her kid was sick and she needed to be texting on the phone to get them out of school, right? Which really changes my understanding of the situation. So sometimes we want to behave and we want to act based on the thought that's triggered from a situation that we're interpreting based on our experience. But if we can slow down and really get curious about, oh, I'm feeling angry, let me check in with someone else or let me get more information, we can really choose more wisely about how we want to behave. And that takes some practice. It's easy to just kind of react based on the first story that comes up in a situation, but we can slow it down and trace it back. So this is the cognitive model. And I think it's really important. And, when we're tired or we haven't eaten, it takes a lot of energy to break this down. But over time, it becomes easier. I think it's also important to remember that emotions are like waves. They are temporary. It's a biochemical rush and then it flushes away, just like waves that come up to the shore. They rush, they're intense. Maybe you've been knocked down by one, but then they come back out. And I sometimes am working with clients in a therapy or coaching session, and they say, I'm really sad about this, but I don't want to feel the sadness because I think I'm going to drown in it. I think I'm not going to be able to move through it, or it'll be with me forever. But the reality is that a feeling gets fired in the brain when we access the thought, and it goes through our bloodstream in 60 to 90 seconds. So that's pretty fast. Now, if we have the same thought that fires again, if we tell ourselves, for example, I'm never going to get a job, maybe there's kind of a rush of anxiety and panic that goes and you feel it for 60 to 90 seconds. Now, I can choose to change the thought to say, I'm worried I'm not going to get a job. And at the same time, I'm going to try my very best. Well, that shifts it a little bit. And maybe I don't feel the same level of intensity of that kind of wave of panic because I've been able to shift the story of the way I'm talking to myself. But if I tell myself again, I'm never going to get a job, I'm going to feel the intensity of that thought again. So our thoughts are really powerful in shaping our emotional experience. So I think it's important to get curious about the way we speak to ourselves, and maybe where there's some kind of uh, thinking traps, right? If we're maybe thinking in black and white, like I'm either going to get all A's in my class or I'm going to fail completely, right? If there's like no either or there's no in between, sometimes we can get stuck in ways of thinking that don't allow us to have space for possibility, or we can kind of get trapped into thinking that can paralyze us. So it's really important for us to process our feelings and not avoid them. I think sometimes people say, well, I just kind of want to avoid anything that's uncomfortable and painful. And of course, that makes sense. And at the same time, it's kind of like a tunnel. You can't get to the other side unless you go through it. If any of you have seen Disney Pixar's Inside Out, I think it illustrates the importance of all feelings. Because when you numb fear or anger or sadness, you also numb joy and happiness. So it's really important for us to feel it all. And Glennon Doyle, a great author, said being human is not about feeling happy, it's about feeling everything. So I think what we can do is learn how to self-regulate our emotions. Emotional regulation is the ability to effectively manage and respond to an emotional experience. So, do you know how to kind of contain and lessen those intense feelings so that you can move through them and feel better? Sometimes I know people try to regulate and try to cope, but it's in unhealthy ways. So, if you're trying to numb negative emotions, again, negative meaning they're not bad, but they're the ones we don't like to feel: sadness, loneliness, fear, anger. Maybe it's with drugs, alcohol, food, exercise, anything that negatively affects or reduces our overall functioning. That's not, a really healthy way to lessen or to regulate the emotions. Now, distraction can be healthy. We don't have to intensely feel something and we feel really out of control, but we can process them in healthier ways. And there's a difference between coping and numbing. Coping might be like calling a friend or taking a bath or crying. Unhealthy, as I mentioned, it could be alcohol or drugs or cutting or self-harm. Resilience is about tolerating the discomfort and taking care of yourself in ways that will help you find well-being in the short term and long term. Because if you use alcohol, it may be a temporary relief, it may numb the pain and be a temporary escape, but ultimately it doesn't really resolve the issue. But processing the feelings and lessening the intensity allows you then to cope and strategize how you can, maybe find solutions or take care of yourself. So I really like this visual on um, strategies for managing stress and anxiety. This first quadrant on the left is a tension centering technique. So to neutralize anxiety, it can often be helpful to use techniques that help you focus your attention away from anxious thoughts. So if I keep thinking like, you know, tomorrow's presentation is going to go so terribly, and my mind keeps jumping to this thought that isn't really happening, but it's in the future. That's where anxiety happens, where our minds are so focused on the future instead of the present moment. Meditation, breathing exercises, visualization really help you ground your mind and your body in the here and now, right now, not on yesterday. That can often bring on feelings of depression, things that we regret, or focusing on the future, things we can't control, but focusing on the moment. These attention centering techniques can really reduce levels of anxiety in healthy ways. Second, expressive creative strategies. So channeling anxious thoughts or feelings in a more productive way, you might be able to find specific outlets. Maybe it's working on a project, maybe it's arts, maybe it's physical movement that changes kind of the chemistry in the body when we move. Um, Reflection, exploration strategies to kind of monitor and pay attention to what those anxiety triggers are, to reflect on anxious thoughts. Maybe journaling, it can be a cathartic experience. Maybe self-monitoring if you're tracking, how long have I been feeling depressed? How long has it been that it's been hard to get out of bed? We can kind of get a sense of where we are. Or communicating, talking with a friend, talking with a therapist helps you process and gain new insight to your experience so that you don't feel like you're kind of flooded in all of the emotion. And then 4, healthy lifestyle values. So you can turn attention toward healthy habits, making sure that your body's getting proper nutrition, that you're getting social experiences, relationships, and again, exercise in healthy ways. So I don't think the goal is that we won't feel anxiety or we won't feel worry, we won't feel stress. The goal is to manage it in ways where we can still make choices and behave in ways that feel, again, in alignment with our values and that ultimately take care of us. I also like this visual, kind of measuring stress. You can, again, get a sense like a kind of a gas gauge. Where am I? Am I in the burnout section here on the right, the red? Am I breaking down? Am I experiencing anxiety and panic? Or am I on the other side? Maybe I'm really inactive. I'm not really doing a lot and I'm not getting enough stress to kind of help me perform in a good way. So they show here at the peak of this model, the stress performance curve, that the best here is at the top, kind of the maybe yellow. If you've ever worked out at the gym, you might lift weights and you put stress on your muscles because the stress does help the muscle break down and then build back up kind of stronger. So we do need stress. We want to be challenged. We want to grow. But then we can hit that exhaustion place where it's no longer helping us perform at our peak performance. So too much stress or overload can then lead to exhaustion and breakdown and burnout. So we really want to monitor, where are my levels of stress and are there things that I can do to keep myself in more of a peak performance place? The goal is to manage and monitor those levels before you get to burnout. When you get to burnout, it's harder to recover. So if you can make sure that the amounts of stress that you have in your life help you reach your goals and protect your body, that's great. But when you start to notice that you're feeling fatigued or exhausted, that's the time to really pay attention and ask yourself, can I take some of these stressors away? Maybe you can't, but how can you take care of yourself through it so that you don't get to that place of burnout? I think it's also important to realize that as you're thinking about what's happening inside of you, what do you need, that this concept of self-care is not selfish. And maybe you've heard this before, but when you get on a plane, I know we all want to get on a plane at this time, they always say in the event of an emergency, put your face mask on before helping someone else. Now, why do they do that? Well, if it can be a very generous gesture to help someone else, but if you are not breathing, then you will not be able to help someone else, right? So self-care is an activity that you do deliberately in order to take care of your mental, emotional, or physical health. So asking yourself, what do I need to feel better, is really serving you, but also serving your community, right? Because you're going to be of more value to your colleagues, to your family, when you take care of yourself, when you set boundaries, when you take time to invest in yourself, whether that's sleep, whether that's food, whether that's exercise. Self-care is not always glamorous. Maybe it's taking out the trash. It's not something you want to do. It's uncomfortable. And yet it promotes well-being and keeps you in a place of stress that is healthy. And I think as you reflect, it's important to consider what your needs are. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And you can see at the bottom, we start with basic needs, food, water, shelter, rest. These are basic needs, safety needs, security. And we first need these needs met before we can get to higher needs of belongingness, esteem needs, feeling of accomplishment, and self-actualization, feeling like you can reach your full potential. So, of course, if you're in a place where you don't have your basic needs met, it's going to be really hard to really access these other higher order needs. I see a question that just came in from Helen. She said, can you talk more about ways to recover if you haven't reached the burnout level of stress? Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I don't think you have to burn out in order to take care of yourself. In fact, I think it's important, I just had the image of like a plant come to mind, and you don't have to water your plant when it's brown already and it's like on its last leg to say, oh, maybe I want to give it some water, right? I think it's important to invest, that maybe you're not always recovering, but I think it depends what you're going through and how you can be gentle, um, and what would help you feel more energized. For example, maybe you've been isolated for a really long time and you've been working a lot and you're starting to feel stressed or burnt out. Well, you might say, well, I want to rest and, take a nap, but maybe recovery and more energy might come from reaching out to a friend and having a phone call. So kind of knowing where you're depleted can help you then know what kind of the recovery treatment, if you will, would be. So you really want to assess what your needs are. Maybe you're feeling really connected with friends, but you just lost your job and you need a sense of safety again and to start a job search. So I think it really depends on what you're going through. It's a good question. I spoke a little bit about this topic, but stressors can certainly be from the external world. You don't have control over COVID right now. You might not have control over, getting sick or whatever it might be, losing a job, but you do have the power to talk to yourself in a compassionate way. I like this quote from Brene Brown. She said, talk to yourself like you would to someone you love. We can create more internal suffering and stress if we beat ourselves up, if we're unkind to ourselves. How could you do so poorly on that presentation? I knew you weren't going to do well, right? If that's the internal talk, we cause a lot more suffering and anxiety and maybe sadness and stress internally for ourselves. But if we say, oh man, that was really hard, that presentation didn't go as well as I wanted, and yet I did my best and I'm going to try better the next time. That compassionate self-talk can really help you weather the storm of something that might be disappointing or uncomfortable. So I always say, what would you say to a friend in this moment? You probably wouldn't be as critical as you might be to yourself. So if we can act as a loving friend to ourselves or a loving parent to ourselves, that can also shape our mental health and what the story or the narrative that we hold on to about who we are and our value. So interesting to kind of slow down as we were talking about that cognitive behavioral model about the situation, the thought, the emotion, and the behavior. Sometimes our emotions are triggered because we are talking to ourselves in ways that are not very kind and maybe are judgmental or shaming. That voice that says you're not good enough, or you don't have a lot to contribute. If that's what we tell ourselves, that's also going to trigger emotions that are uncomfortable. So self-talk is really a huge part, I think, of mental health. Just want to share a couple of resources in the last couple of minutes, because it's a practice to create a more resilient brain. We really have to slow down. We have to take time to notice and pay attention to our thoughts. Thoughts can be automatic. Sometimes we have intrusive thoughts. Not all thoughts are facts, so we have to kind of slow down and get curious about them. But I really like a lot of these mindfulness apps. Again, mindfulness is the practice of being here in the moment. Our brains are not thinking about what we're going to do tomorrow or what's going to happen next year. We're coming to the present moment. And if in the present moment we are safe, we are healthy, then we can create a sense of calm and peace, because that is the truth of the moment now, right? We can't control what's going to happen tomorrow. And if we panic about getting sick in the future, we really don't have control over it. So if we can bring our minds back and our attention back to the present moment, we can remind ourselves that we are safe, and that can reduce anxiety or panic. So some of these that I mentioned, the mood meter was from a way to track and also build your vocabulary, your emotional vocabulary. If we can name it, we can kind of tame and soothe the amygdala, that part, that emotional part of the brain when we validate our own emotions. Calm, stop, think, breathe, insight timer. There's lots of wonderful apps. So I'd encourage you to check some of those out as a practice. Again, it's kind of strength training for our brain. If we just do it once, we don't really form those new connections in our brain. But if we actively practice on being present, then we can kind of retrain our brain to remind ourselves we are safe, because we're always looking for danger. We can remind ourselves of the truth of being safe in the moment. And there's some really wonderful books out there. The Feeling Good Handbook is a really good one. If you're interested in learning more about this compassionate talk, self-compassion, Kristin Neff has a wonderful book, or Tara Brach on radical acceptance, accepting emotions that come up and getting curious about them without judgment, because feelings just are, and they're data that come up. So a couple of these are by Brene Brown, which I really love her work. She has a wonderful TED Talk on vulnerability and shame and emotional intelligence 2.0. So these are just a couple of resources. If there has been a topic this evening that you feel you'd like to learn a little bit more, again, I think it's so important to reduce the stigma around mental health, because we all have mental health, we all have a brain. It's important to understand how it works, and then also help others understand and validate what they're going through. So I'd love to open up the floor for the last few minutes that we have together for any questions. If you have any questions after the presentation, you can certainly email me or find me on LinkedIn or Instagram. I see a question here from Diane. She said, I am concerned about my JHU freshman who is living on campus, but all her classes are virtual. She has not made friends and spends most of her time in her single dorm room. Can you share tips for college freshmen who may be feeling isolated while following social distancing guidelines in a new environment? Yeah, that's a really great question. And I'm sure we're all experiencing that to some extent of being more isolated. I think it's, we are told that we need to physically distance, but we don't need to socially distance. So it doesn't take away our craving for touch and wanting to be with others, but we can do small things to still reach out. So I'm curious, maybe there are some online communities, I don't know, maybe with the university, if there may be an online book group, or there might be some online volunteering opportunities. It may not be ideal, but still reaching out and not just being isolated is really important. So whether it's reaching out to family or friends or seeing what communities might be online, it's really important that that people are still reaching out. And yeah, it's really hard being a freshman. I can only imagine when you don't know people who are new. I would say find maybe virtual offerings that allow them to connect. It's a great question. Here's another question from Ken. There are common signs of depression that are well known, like exhaustion or sadness. Can you talk about some other signs that may not be as recognizable? That's a great question. And if you're really looking for the full list, for someone to be diagnosed with depression, now, of course, people go through signs like, feeling sad or exhausted. Doesn't necessarily mean that someone is depressed. In the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which has all diagnoses, there are certain criteria that someone has to have a number of symptoms for a certain duration or frequency over time that would make diagnosable. But anger can be depression. Anger is like a secondary emotion, but sometimes sadness is underneath. So there can be kind of a frustrated depression that might not be as commonly seen. Um, yeah, if it's hard to get out of bed, if you notice appetite changes, sometimes sleep changes, anything that's changing your, day-to-day functioning, those could be some things. Um, Dan adds, I find it difficult to dial in the exhausted optimal state. Any suggestions? Okay, I want to see if I understand this correctly. So, and maybe you can provide a little bit more, but is there like an optimal amount of tiredness? Is that the question? I think the hope is that we feel rested, but certainly during this time, it can be difficult if you've got kids at home. Yeah, you're going to be more tired. So I think it's important to get as much sleep as you can. Of course, we spend a lot of time on our phones, especially as they are our connection to the outside world for news and sense of community. So doing anything to create a nighttime routine to kind of tell your body we're shutting down can help your system start to have a more optimal sleep experience. So it's good to find a regular time that you're going to go to bed and get up, and create a space that feels comforting so that you can relax. Okay. Oh, here's another question. I am concerned about the high stress levels at JHU with the heavy workload. Thoughts on how to help the overachiever suffering from the imposter syndrome convinced she isn't enough? Okay, that's a great question. So, I think it's really important to maybe pay attention to expectations, especially at this time. I think pre-pandemic, I'm sure workload was heavy at Hopkins in general, but I think it's important to think about how you take care of yourself. But at this time, having an expectation, for example, that you're going to study like 12 hours a day, or that you're going to read 100% of the books that you have is probably just not realistic. So I think it's important to set more realistic expectations so that you don't set yourself up for disappointment and always feel like I'm failing because I'm not doing everything 100%. So I guess I'd be curious about, what does achievement really look like for you? What are your expectations and are they realistic? This concept of imposter syndrome, the sense that you're not smart enough or good enough or someone's going to find out. I think a lot of that comes from what are the messages you tell yourself about yourself. If you can kind of name it and say, you know what, I'm telling myself that I'm not capable right now, that's not really a very compassionate thought. I'm maybe feeling like I don't understand this concept, and yet I can go ask for help. So I think when you notice those types of thoughts, if you can name them and kind of observe them without judgment, like, oh, that's coming up again. Maybe it's trying to protect me from something. Maybe I don't want to fail. So maybe if I tell myself, I'm not good at something, maybe I won't really actually try. So it's just interesting to kind of get curious about what the thought patterns are. And maybe you want to reshape the narrative about who you are in relationship to your work. And again, I just come back to expectations at this time, and how can you create a more realistic, compassionate expectation for yourself? And also, how can you take breaks? How can you make sure that you're nourishing yourself? Is it heroic to burn out? Is it heroic not to sleep and stay up all night? If that's not going to ultimately help you achieve your goals, maybe the definition of working hard, needs to change. So that's a really good question. I know we can all struggle with that. Another question here: after months of isolation, I worry I may develop some anxiety in social situations. Any tips to work back into a social scene? Yeah, that's a great question. I think we're all going to have to adjust. I think, what is it like to be close to people again, not 6 feet apart? I think it's important to do things slowly, in the sense that if you're feeling some anxiety, you don't necessarily have to throw yourself into this huge group, maybe slowly exposing yourself in small amounts can introduce you to feeling more comfortable again being in social situations. So yeah, maybe you meet up with one friend for coffee and then, kind of slowly build up from there. Um, but you don't have to, you know, be upset with yourself if it doesn't come easily. You can take some slow steps to kind of expose yourself and kind of learn to kind of tolerate that experience if it's felt uncomfortable in the past. So that's a good question. Any other questions? Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for joining us this evening. I think it's been really helpful to hear your questions, and I'm really grateful that you're open to this conversation because we again can help ourselves and help our community when we talk about mental health and how we create a more resilient brain. So these are ways, again, you can contact me if you have any other questions. But I hope that you have a wonderful evening and thanks for joining.